In 2020, in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, then President Donald Trump secretly sent COVID testing equipment to Russia for the personal use of Vladimir Putin. Not at-home COVID tests, like you can buy at the drugstore now. Those weren't available yet. This was too early in the pandemic for those. I'm talking about drug testing equipment. Kudos, by the way, to Keith Olbermann for pointing out this particular detail of this story that a lot of other outlets who've been reporting on it have frankly missed or failed to specify. Olbermann, I know I've mentioned him before in a video or two in the past. He's an often very frustrating and occasionally infuriating figure. But when all is said and done, he's one of the good guys. And when he's not twisting a news story into an excuse to tell a digressive, self-flattering personal anecdote that you've already heard him tell about 15 times in the last few months, or gossiping about one of his exes, or spending minutes of his show to obsess over some Republican's poor grammar or spelling, Olbermann is capable of a level of clarity and justified moral indignation that is all too rare in today's political media. So once again, kudos to him for talking about this on his podcast and bringing out this particular detail that shows that this story is actually even worse than you may have initially thought it was. Olbermann, in his relating of the Trump-Putin COVID test story, made sure to specify that it was not as if Trump simply stuffed a few at-home COVID tests into an envelope and sent them off to Moscow in a gesture of goodwill. According to CNN, which was one of the first news outlets to break this story, Trump sent Putin, quote, a bunch of Abbott point-of-care COVID test machines. I haven't been able to find more detail than that, but based on the fact that what Trump sent Putin is consistently described in stories from various outlets as COVID testing machines or COVID testing equipment or COVID testing devices, I'm assuming that what Trump sent to Putin was this, or rather, several of these. This is what's called the Abbott ID Now. And this device is about the size of a toaster, and it analyzes samples from people who are suspected of having COVID, and it can return a positive result in about 5 minutes. Trump apparently sent a bunch of these testing machines to Vladimir Putin in the early months of the pandemic, when COVID tests, and I'm sure most of you remember this, were really scarce. It was not easy in the early months of the pandemic to go get a test. There were designated testing centers that were set up that you had to go to. You couldn't just go to CVS and get a COVID test or make an appointment with your doctor and get a COVID test. These things were in high demand. And at that time, President Donald Trump sent tests and testing equipment that could have been used to help Americans to the autocratic leader of Russia, not to help the people of Russia in some kind of show of diplomacy, but as a personal favor to Vladimir Putin for his personal use. 3 points come to mind for me about this story. First, obviously, it's yet another piece of evidence to add to the pile of evidence that Trump wants to be our Putin. When he runs for president, when he hopes to become president again, that's the kind of leader he wants to be. He wants to be like Vladimir Putin. He openly admires authoritarians like Putin, like the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. He seeks their personal friendship and approval and celebrates how well he gets along with them and how well they like him. Like that's a good thing for an American president to be. Oh, Vladimir Putin loves me. Viktor Orban thinks I'm great. And he wants to transform the American presidency into an office more like the ones they hold. He wants to be able to do the same things as president of the United States that Vladimir Putin can do as president of Russia. In addition to that, Trump seems to have a great deal of personal loyalty to Putin, loyalty that compels him to choose Putin's interests over those of Americans or the interests of the United States as a whole. And again, Vladimir Putin's personal interests, not the interests of Russia, not the interests of the Russian people, which even that would not exactly be great news to hear, that the president of the United States is more interested in what's good for Russia and the Russian people than he is in what's good for the people of the United States, the country he was elected to lead. But it's not even that. It's literally the personal interests of Vladimir Putin as an individual. And whether that loyalty is due to Putin having some kind of leverage over Trump, or whether it's just due to the fact that Trump genuinely likes helping out his bestie, I have no idea. And I don't think it really makes much of a difference, practically speaking. It still is what it is, regardless of the reasons behind it. I'm not saying we shouldn't want to find out the reasons behind it, especially if the reason is that the president of Russia has some kind of really serious heavy-duty blackmail material on Donald Trump, and that's why he's behaving this way, because he's compromised by the Russians. I'm not saying we shouldn't want to know that if that's the case. But practically speaking, Trump's behavior is what it is, whether he's doing it because he feels like he has to because Putin has something on him, or whether he's doing it because he just really likes Vladimir Putin and wants to be just like him and wants Putin to be impressed by him. It doesn't really make a difference one way or the other. Second thing, remember when Trump started discouraging people in this country from getting tested? It was like the first summer of the pandemic, June, July, August of 2020. Trump started to say that we're having too many people get tested. We're focusing too much on testing. Testing is a bad thing because all of the testing is the reason that there were so many cases of COVID being reported. And he said that like it was a bad thing, like we shouldn't want to know how many people have COVID in the middle of a pandemic. We need to stop testing. That's how we get all these cases. Like remember when he said that? You probably remember when he said that, right? I guess he didn't say that to Vladimir Putin. Huh, what's that, Vlad? COVID tests. Oh, no, man, you don't want those. The more you test, the more cases you find. You don't need that. If you think you're coming down with something, just eat some fucking horse paste. You'll be fine. Third, the reason we know about any of this is because Bob Woodward writes about it in a forthcoming book titled War. That line in the CNN story that I read from about Trump sending Putin a bunch of Abbott point-of-care COVID test machines, that's a quote from Bob Woodward's book, which is due to be released in about a week. My question is, how long has Bob Woodward known about this? And why didn't he report this information to the public earlier? Bob, don't you think the American people have a right to know that the former president, who is running to be president again, diverted COVID testing equipment that could have benefited American physicians and American patients to the president of Russia? Don't you think the public has a right to know that information as soon as you have verified that it's true? Not whenever it's time to start ramping up publicity for your book? This isn't the first time Woodward has pulled this shit either. 4 years ago, in September of 2020, Woodward published a book called Rage, in which he reveals that despite publicly playing dumb and calling COVID a hoax in the early days of the outbreak, Trump knew the coronavirus was real, it was airborne, and it was far more dangerous than a typical flu virus. Trump knew this very early in the pandemic. In fact, before there were mass deaths in the United States due to COVID. Woodward heard this from Trump himself during an interview he conducted with Trump in early February of 2020. But Woodward didn't tell the public about this until it was time for his book to come out in September of 2020. What the hell happened to you, Bob? You're a journalist. You're a reporter. I know you were writing a book and you want people to buy the book, but Jesus Christ, man. I wasn't alive back then, but I seem to remember learning about how you and Carl Bernstein uncovered the Watergate scandal in the 70s, and I'm pretty sure you were printing most of that shit in the Washington Post as you found it out, not saving it for a book you were planning to publish years after Richard Nixon left office. You're 81 years old, Bob. You've been a famous writer for 50 years. Movies have been made based on your work. Do you not have enough money? Did you not save anything, Bob? Is publishing a couple more bestsellers in the final years of your life really necessary for you? Really more important than informing the public when you find out about some crooked shit the president did? Maybe you and your agent and your publisher care more about selling your book, but I don't. And I don't see why anyone else should either. Nobody gives a shit about your book, Bob.